I'd spent 23 days in Oakwood Memorial Hospital, watching autumn leaves drift past my window, and during that entire time, my own son, James, and his sister, Rebecca, might as well have been ghosts. Constant text messages about being swamped at work and promises to visit as soon as things ease up a bit that never materialized into actual presence. The irony that cut deepest? It was my daughter-in-law, Victoria, the quiet Japanese-American woman my son had married against my initial judgment, who appeared every morning without fail, her gentle hands changing my bandages, adjusting my pillows, and somehow always arriving with a thermos of ginger tea steeped exactly how I liked it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The doctors said I was lucky. The infection could have spread to my heart if I'd waited another day to come to the emergency room. But lying there, watching Victoria methodically organize my medications while my own children couldn't spare an hour from their precious schedules, lucky wasn't exactly the word that came to mind. People talk about blood being thicker than water, but what they forget is that both can evaporate when the heat gets too intense. And sometimes the person who catches the drops before they're gone isn't the one you expected at all. My name is Eleanor Mitchell, 68 years old, retired high school literature teacher, widow of 7 years, grandmother to 3, and until 3 weeks ago, I'd prided myself on independence. I'd managed just fine in my 2-story craftsman home in Silver Lake after Harold passed. I tended my garden, hosted my book club on Thursdays, and walked the 2 miles to the farmer's market every weekend with my canvas tote bags, sensible shoes, and a stubbornness that my late husband used to both admire and lament. The morning everything changed started ordinarily enough. I'd been feeling under the weather for a few days, what I dismissed as a lingering cold or perhaps seasonal allergies. Nothing that warranted concern. I'd made it through raising 2 children on a teacher's salary while Harold built his accounting practice. I'd survived his sudden heart attack 7 years ago that left me alone in our queen-sized bed. A little fatigue and persistent cough barely registered on my scale of troubles. That particular Tuesday, I'd planned to repot the orchids that lined my kitchen window. I remember the way the morning light filtered through the blinds, casting zebra stripes across the ceramic pots I'd arranged on newspaper sheets. I'd just finished my toast and coffee when a violent coughing fit overtook me, the kind that leaves you gasping, bent double, spots dancing in your vision. When I finally caught my breath and straightened, I noticed something alarming on the white kitchen tile. Bright crimson droplets. Blood. Even then, my first instinct wasn't to call for help. Instead, I found myself thinking about the parent-teacher conference I'd scheduled with James's 5th grade teacher decades ago, the one I never missed despite running a fever of 102, because that's what mothers do. They show up, they push through, they don't burden others with their problems. I wiped the blood with a paper towel and told myself it was probably just a broken blood vessel from the forceful coughing. I'd finish with the orchids and then maybe call my doctor for an appointment later in the week. But as I lifted the first plant, another coughing spell hit, worse this time. The room tilted sideways, the terracotta pot slipping from my fingers and shattering against the floor, soil exploding across the pristine tiles that I'd mopped just yesterday. I stumbled to the counter, gripping its edge as the kitchen spun around me like a carnival ride. My chest felt as though it was being crushed between 2 stones, each breath becoming shallower than the last. The pain radiated through my ribs, up my neck, behind my eyes. My knees buckled, and as I slid down against the cabinets, I had the oddest thought, who would water my orchids if I didn't get back up? With trembling fingers, I reached for my phone in my cardigan pocket. I hesitated over the contacts. James was my firstborn, my responsible one. At least he had been before the promotion at the investment firm and the house in Brentwood Hills. But I knew he had that important client meeting today. He'd mentioned it 3 times during our brief Sunday call. Rebecca then, my daughter, who lived just 15 minutes away in her rented bungalow where she worked remotely as a graphic designer. Surely she could adjust her schedule. The phone rang 4 times before Rebecca's voicemail picked up. I hung up and tried again, desperation making my fingers clumsy on the screen. This time she answered, her voice immediately tense. "Mom, I'm in the middle of a client presentation. Can I call you back?" "I need help," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something's wrong. I'm coughing up blood." There was a pause, the faint sound of a door closing. "Blood? Have you called your doctor?" Her voice lowered. "I've got this massive deadline, the Hendricks project I told you about. Can you call an Uber to the urgent care? I can meet you there after my presentation." I closed my eyes. The pain in my chest, nothing compared to the one blooming in my heart. "I don't think I can make it to the door," I admitted. Another pause. Okay, let me think. What about Mrs. Abernathy next door? Or, wait, isn't today when your gardener comes?" "Rebecca, I need you," I said, hearing the plea in my own voice and hating it. I had never wanted to be a burden to my children, had structured my entire widowhood around self-sufficiency. "Mom, I can't just walk out on this presentation. We're talking about a 6-figure contract here." Her voice had that edge to it, the one that appeared whenever she felt cornered. "Let me call James. His office is closer anyway." Before I could respond, she had hung up. I sat there on the kitchen floor, surrounded by broken pottery and soil, wondering when exactly my daughter had become someone who could put a presentation before her mother coughing up blood. I wanted to be angry, but mostly I just felt tired. So profoundly tired. 10 minutes passed, then 15. No call from James. With each passing moment, the tightness in my chest increased. Finally, with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, I dialed 911. "I think I need an ambulance," I told the dispatcher, my teacher's articulation slipping away as my words began to slur at the edges. The paramedics arrived in what seemed like both an eternity and an instant. I remember fragments after that. The oxygen mask over my face, the strange weightless feeling as they lifted me onto the stretcher, the kaleidoscope of my kitchen ceiling as they wheeled me out. One of them, a young man with kind eyes, held my hand in the ambulance and asked if there was someone they should call. "My son," I whispered through the mask. "James Mitchell." In the emergency room, everything accelerated. Doctors in blue scrubs swarmed around me, their voices overlapping as they called out numbers and medical terms. Severe pneumonia, oxygen saturation dropping, possible sepsis, need consent for intubation if necessary. A harried-looking doctor with silver-streaked hair leaned over me. "Mrs. Mitchell, we need to start aggressive treatment immediately. Is there family we can contact? Someone who can be here?" I nodded weakly and gave them James's number again. As they wheeled me toward the ICU, I caught a glimpse of the waiting room clock. 11:42 a.m. James would be in his client meeting now. Rebecca still in her presentation. The thought drifted through my mind that I might die surrounded by strangers, in blue masks rather than the children I had raised. Instead of feeling sorry for myself, I found my thoughts turning to my students from over the years. How many Shakespearean sonnets had I helped them analyze? How many essays had I pored over? Until midnight, leaving careful comments in the margins? I'd never missed a parent conference, never called in sick during final exams. I'd shown up for other people's children for 42 years. And now, when I needed someone to show up for me? Hours later, I awoke in the ICU to the steady beeping of monitors and the hiss of oxygen. The room was dimly lit, and for a moment I thought I was alone. Then I noticed a figure hunched in the chair beside my bed, head bowed over what appeared to be a book. "James?" I croaked, my throat raw from the tubes they'd put down it during some procedure I couldn't remember. The figure startled and looked up. Not James. Not Rebecca. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was Victoria, my son's wife of 5 years. The woman I'd initially been cool toward because she'd seemed too quiet, too reserved, too different from our boisterous Mitchell family gatherings. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her normally immaculate appearance rumpled as though she'd rushed out without a thought to how she looked. "Eleanor, you're awake!" She moved to my side, her hands fluttering nervously before settling on adjusting my blanket. "How are you feeling? Are you in pain? The doctor said to call immediately when you woke up." I blinked at her, confusion washing over me. "Victoria, where's James?" Something flickered across her face, a shadow of discomfort quickly masked. "He's trying to reschedule his meetings. He'll be here soon." She reached for the call button. "Let me get the nurse." "What time is it?" I asked, noticing the darkness beyond the window. "Just after 9. "At night," she added when she saw my confusion. 9 at night. I'd been brought in before noon. "Rebecca?" Victoria busied herself pouring water into a plastic cup with a straw. "She called earlier. She's finishing up her project deadline and will come first thing tomorrow." A nurse bustled in then, checking monitors and asking me questions I answered on autopilot. When she left, the room fell into awkward silence. Victoria had never been one for small talk, and I had never made much effort to bridge that gap between us. She was simply James's wife, the woman who seemed perpetually uncomfortable at family gatherings, who brought elaborately beautiful but oddly flavored dishes to Thanksgiving, who spoke to her mother in rapid-fire Japanese on the phone while I pretended not to notice. "You didn't have to come," I said finally. "I'm sure you have better things to do." Victoria looked at me directly, her dark eyes steady. "No, I didn't have better things to do. Your family." Something in the simplicity of her statement made my throat tighten. Family. The same word I'd used countless times when coaxing James to call his sister after their fights, when reminding Rebecca to send her grandfather a birthday card, when justifying why I hosted every holiday despite the exhaustion it brought. Before I could respond, the door opened and a doctor entered, Dr. Patel according to her nameplate. She explained my condition with brisk efficiency. Severe pneumonia complicated by sepsis, the infection having already entered my bloodstream by the time I arrived. I would need to remain hospitalized for at least 2 weeks on IV antibiotics. The next 72 hours would be critical. I caught Victoria taking notes in a small notebook, her handwriting meticulous. When Dr. Patel mentioned potential side effects of the medication regimen, Victoria asked intelligent questions I was too exhausted to formulate. When discussions turned to insurance details, she produced my insurance card, somehow already in her possession. After the doctor left, Victoria moved her chair closer to my bed. "James gave me the spare key to your house," she explained, seeing my confusion. "I picked up a few things for you. Toothbrush, your reading glasses, the book from your nightstand." She gestured to a small overnight bag in the corner. "And I watered the orchids. The blue pot was broken, but I cleaned it up. The orchids. My broken pot." The mundane details of my interrupted morning suddenly seemed impossibly distant, as though they had happened to someone else in another lifetime. I felt tears welling up and turned my face away, not wanting this reserved daughter-in-law whom I barely knew to see me cry. "Thank you," I managed. Victoria simply nodded, then opened her book again, giving me privacy while staying present. I noticed then that it wasn't a novel but a medical reference guide, with sections highlighted and post-it notes protruding from various pages. As I drifted back to sleep, my last conscious thought was wondering why Victoria had a medical reference book, and why she was reading about pneumonia and sepsis at my bedside instead of being home with her husband, my son who couldn't manage to show up himself. The next morning, I awoke to find Victoria still there, asleep in the chair with her, coat draped over her like a blanket, neck bent at an angle that would surely leave her in pain. On the small table beside her sat 2 phones, hers and what I recognized as James's, a message notification lighting up his screen. She must have taken it from him at some point. As if sensing my gaze, Victoria stirred and straightened, wincing slightly as she rotated her stiff neck. When she saw me watching her, she offered a small, tired smile. "You stayed all night?" I said, not bothering to hide my surprise. She nodded, gathering her hair back into its ponytail. "The nurses said the first night can be difficult. I didn't want you to wake up alone." "But James had an early client breakfast he couldn't reschedule," she finished for me, no judgment in her tone, just a statement of fact. Before I could respond, the door swung open and Rebecca hurried in, designer handbag swinging from her arm, coffee cup in hand, looking harried but put together in a way that suggested she'd taken time with her appearance. Before coming. "Mom!" she exclaimed, depositing her coffee and bag on a side table before approaching the bed. "You look terrible." She turned to Victoria. "Why didn't anyone call me when she woke up last night?" Victoria's expression remained neutral. "I texted James. I thought he would inform you." Rebecca waved this away. "Well, I'm here now. You can go home and get some rest, Victoria. I've cleared my morning schedule." I watched Victoria gather her things without protest, tucking the medical reference book into her bag alongside my son's phone. At the door, she paused and looked back at me. "I'll return this evening with some fresh clothes for you," she said quietly. "If that's all right." I found myself nodding, oddly reluctant to see her go. "Thank you, Victoria, for everything." After she left, Rebecca launched into an exhaustive explanation of her project deadline and how she'd moved mountains to be here now. She fussed over my blankets, complained about the hospital coffee, and talked incessantly about everything except what had happened yesterday. Her refusal to come when I needed her most. "James feels awful about yesterday," she said eventually, scrolling through her phone as she spoke. "That client meeting was massive, though. Literally make or break for his promotion track." I studied my daughter's perfect manicure, her expensive highlights, the designer watch on her wrist. "I was coughing up blood on my kitchen floor," I said quietly. Rebecca looked up, a flash of guilt crossing her face before hardening into defensiveness. "And you got help, didn't you? The system worked. We can't all drop everything at a moment's notice, Mom. That's why there are emergency services." That's when I knew something had fundamentally shifted in me. My children, these successful, busy adults I'd raised, had become strangers I didn't particularly like. And Victoria, the daughter-in-law I'd kept at arm's length, had shown more genuine care in one night than my own flesh and blood had in years. I closed my eyes, suddenly too tired for Rebecca's justifications. "I think I need to rest now." Of course. I'll come back tomorrow, or maybe the next day. We've got the Henderson presentation follow-up, but I'll make it work somehow." After she left, I lay there watching shadows move across the ceiling, thinking about the years I'd spent cultivating relationships with my children. The soccer games I'd cheered through in pouring rain, the science projects I'd helped salvage at midnight, the countless times I'd rearranged my life to put their needs first. Somehow, in raising them to succeed, I'd failed to teach them the most important lesson of all, that love isn't just a feeling, it's showing up when it matters. That evening, true to her word, Victoria returned. This time she brought not only fresh nightgowns and toiletries, but also framed photos from my bedroom dresser. Harold and me on our 40th anniversary, the children at various ages, my 3 grandchildren. She arranged them on the windowsill where I could see them from bed. "I thought it might make the room feel less strange," she explained as she set up the last frame. My favorite picture of Harold in his garden, hat tilted back, laughing at something off camera. Hospitals can be so impersonal. I watched her methodical movements, noting how she anticipated needs I hadn't even articulated, adjusting the height of my bed without being asked, placing the call button within easy reach, unpacking my favorite, hand cream and applying it to my papery skin with gentle strokes. "Why are you doing all this, Victoria?" I finally asked as she arranged my medications in the order I would need to take them. She looked startled by the question, her hands going. Still, for a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then she sat in the chair beside me, her posture perfect as always, hands folded in her lap. "Before I met James, I was a nurse," she said quietly. "Oncology unit. I know what it's like to be alone in a hospital room." This was news to me. "I thought you worked in your family's import business." "I do now, after we married." She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her pants. "It was easier with James's schedule." I felt a pang of shame at how little I knew about this woman who had been part of our family for 5 years. "You gave up nursing for my son?" Something flashed in her eyes. Not resentment, but a certain resignation. "I made a choice. In my family, we believe in supporting each other, even when it requires sacrifice." "And where is my son now?" I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Victoria met my gaze directly. Making different choices. In that moment of startling honesty between us, I recognized something I'd been missing for a long time. Someone who understood the value of showing up without excuses, without conditions. Someone who didn't just talk about family, but lived it through actions. I reached for Victoria's hand, the first time I had ever initiated physical contact with her. "Thank you for being here," I said, my voice rough with emotion. "For seeing me." Her fingers curled around mine, warm and steady. "I see you, Eleanor. I always have." That night, after Victoria had gone home with promises to return in the morning, I made a decision. When I was discharged from this hospital, things would be different. The children who couldn't make time for their dying mother would no longer be the beneficiaries of my most valuable possession, the craftsman home that had been in our family for generations. No, that legacy would go to the person who had earned it through actions, not blood. My journey with Gerald began long before Blackwell Financial existed. We met at the Northeast Financial Summit in 1994, during a breakout session on emerging markets. I was presenting my analysis on Southeast Asian investment opportunities, commanding the room with data and projections that challenged the conventional wisdom at the time. At 38, I had built a reputation as a meticulous analyst with an uncanny ability to spot market shifts before they happened. Gerald approached me afterward, not with the condescending flirtation I'd grown accustomed to deflecting, but with genuine questions about my methodology. "Your correlation between political instability indicators and market volatility was fascinating," he said, his eyes reflecting actual interest rather than merely assessing me as a potential conquest. 2 hours later, we were still deep in conversation at the hotel bar, surrounded by empty coffee cups. By the time we parted ways, we had exchanged business cards and the unmistakable electricity of intellectual connection. A week later, he called to discuss a potential collaboration on a client portfolio. 3 months later, we were inseparable. What drew me to Gerald wasn't just his charm, though he had plenty, but how he seemed to value my mind. After years of having male colleagues take credit for my work or dismiss my insights, Gerald's appreciation felt revolutionary. "You see patterns others miss," he once told me, holding my face in his hands with genuine admiration. "It's like you have financial sonar." I had no way of knowing then that this admiration would gradually transform into appropriation. Our early days together were intoxicating. We would spend evenings analyzing market trends, sketching business models on napkins, imagining the firm we could build together. Though I had a secure position at Wellington Associates, Gerald convinced me that we could create something truly exceptional as a team. "Think about it, Margaret," he said one snowy evening as we walked along the Charles River. "Your analytical skills combined with my client relationships, we could transform boutique wealth management. When Gerald discovered that retiring financial advisor Charles Winthrop was selling his modest but solid client book, we saw our opportunity. The asking price was steep, $1.2 million for a portfolio worth approximately $40 million in assets under management. We pooled our savings, took out a second mortgage on Gerald's Beacon Hill apartment, and secured a high-interest business loan for the remainder. What Gerald didn't know was that I also liquidated my secret safety net, a small inheritance from my grandmother that I'd grown through careful investments. I had maintained this separate account throughout my adult life, a habit instilled by my Depression-era grandmother who insisted that a woman should always have her own money that no one knows about. I contributed $230,000 to our startup capital, but told Gerald it was only $100,000, keeping the knowledge of my full financial reserves to myself. The night before we signed the purchase agreement, I prepared a comprehensive transition strategy. I analyzed each client's portfolio, identified underperforming assets, researched tax optimization opportunities, and created personalized investment plans for each of the 37 clients we were acquiring. While Gerald slept, I refined projections and created presentation materials that would reassure Winthrop's nervous clients that their money would be in capable hands. When I showed Gerald my work the next morning, his eyes widened. "This is exceptional, Margaret. With this level of personalization, we might not just retain Winthrop's clients, we could grow their assets significantly." We opened Blackwell Advisory Services in a modest office on Milk Street in downtown Boston. Our furniture was a hodgepodge of estate sale finds and pieces borrowed from my sister's basement. Our technology consisted of 2 desktop computers and a shared fax machine. What we lacked in polish, we made up for with intense personal attention to each client. While Gerald focused on client acquisition and relationship management, I immersed myself in the actual work of growing their money. I developed a proprietary method for evaluating risk that incorporated both traditional metrics and what I called human factor analysis, considering the specific life circumstances, emotional risk tolerance, and future needs of each client. This approach allowed us to create truly customized portfolios, rather than simply slotting clients into predetermined investment categories. Our first major innovation came when I identified a pattern among our client demographics. Nearly 40% were physicians or medical specialists who had unique financial concerns: high student debt in their early careers, malpractice insurance costs, irregular income patterns during residency and fellowship, and specific retirement needs. Rather than treating them like any other high-income professionals, I developed specialized investment strategies addressing these particular challenges. "Doctors aren't just rich people with medical degrees," I explained to Gerald while presenting my research. "They have specific financial chronologies that differ from corporate executives or entrepreneurs. If we tailor our approach to address their unique concerns, we could dominate this niche market." Gerald presented my strategy at a healthcare conference the following month, delivering my research verbatim. When 3 major medical practices signed with us afterward, bringing nearly $20 million in new assets, Gerald returned triumphant. "They loved our medical specialist approach," he said, the slip so quick I almost missed it. "This could be our golden ticket." By our 5th anniversary, Blackwell Advisory Services had grown to $175 million in assets under management. We moved to larger offices on State Street and hired our first 3 employees. Gerald convinced me that as the firm grew, our roles needed to be more clearly defined. "You're brilliant with the numbers and strategy, Margaret, but I should be the face of the company," he reasoned. "Clients respond to me, and you can focus on what you do best without the pressure of client-facing responsibilities." It made sense at the time. Gerald had natural charisma and an easy way with people, while I preferred the intellectual challenge of portfolio management to the emotional labor of client dinners. What I didn't realize was that this division would eventually erase my contributions entirely. When the tech bubble burst in 2000, many financial advisory firms suffered devastating losses. I had been monitoring the unsustainable valuations for months, gradually shifting our clients to more conservative positions. While competitors watched their clients' portfolios plummet 30–40%, our losses were limited to 12%. I spent sleepless weeks rebalancing assets, identifying buying opportunities in the chaos, and preparing detailed communications to reassure nervous clients. At the emergency client meeting Gerald organized, he stood confidently before the worried crowd. While others were caught up in market euphoria, he announced, Blackwell Advisory maintained disciplined valuation metrics and strategic diversification that protected your assets. Not once did he mention that it was my valuation model, my diversification strategy, my midnight oil that had safeguarded their money. Following the dot-com recovery, we expanded significantly, opening satellite offices in Hartford and Providence. With each expansion, my role became increasingly invisible to the outside world. On paper, I was listed as financial advisor, a title that conveyed nothing of my true function as the architect of the firm's investment philosophy. Meanwhile, Gerald's business cards read, founder and chief investment strategist, though he hadn't constructed a portfolio in years. Our 10th anniversary coincided with another pivotal moment, the decision to pursue institutional clients. I developed a presentation targeting university endowments, demonstrating how our risk management approach could provide stable returns even during market volatility. Gerald delivered my presentation to the board of Eastland College, a small but wealthy liberal arts institution. When they entrusted us with $80 million of their endowment, it transformed our business overnight. You should have seen their faces. When I explained our proprietary volatility metrics, Gerald boasted that evening over celebratory champagne. The chairman practically signed on the spot. Our metrics, I corrected gently. Gerald blinked, momentarily confused. Well, yes, of course. Blackwell's metrics. The elision of my contribution became so common that I eventually stopped noticing. At industry conferences, Gerald would present research I had prepared, analysis I had conducted, strategies I had developed, all without attribution. When financial publications interviewed him about Blackwell's distinctive approach, he spoke about my philosophy and my methods, as if they had sprung fully formed from his mind alone. Perhaps the most painful example came in 2007, when I began noticing troubling patterns in mortgage-backed securities. While most financial advisors were still eagerly incorporating these instruments into client portfolios, I spent months analyzing the underlying loan quality and default risk models. What I found alarmed me deeply. We need to divest from these products immediately, I told Gerald one evening, presenting my research. The default assumptions are fundamentally flawed. When adjustable rates reset, we're going to see massive failures. Gerald was skeptical. Everyone is using these securities, Margaret. The ratings agencies give them top marks. The ratings don't reflect the actual risk, I insisted. If we don't act now, our clients could lose everything. After 3 days of intense debate, Gerald reluctantly agreed to my recommendation. Over the next 6 months, I systematically restructured every client portfolio, moving assets to treasury securities, certain commodities, and carefully selected blue-chip stocks with minimal exposure to the housing market. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, our clients were largely protected from the worst devastation. While other firms faced client losses of 40–50% and subsequent mass withdrawals, Blackwell Financial, as we were now called, actually grew its assets under management as panicked investors sought safer harbors. The Boston Business Journal requested an interview about our prescient market move. Gerald sat for a professional photo shoot in his office, looking appropriately serious yet confident. I've always maintained a healthy skepticism toward complex financial instruments, he told the reporter. When my analysis suggested trouble in the mortgage market, I acted decisively to protect our clients. I read the article while sitting at our kitchen island, my morning coffee turning bitter in my mouth. Beside the glowing profile was a sidebar. Gerald Blackwell's wife, Margaret, manages the firm's charitable foundation and community relations. That was the moment I should have confronted him, should have demanded recognition for the work that had built our now considerable fortune. Instead, I swallowed my resentment and focused on the task at hand, navigating the post-crisis landscape to maximize recovery for our clients. I told myself the results mattered more than the credit. As our children grew up and started their own families, I found joy in my role as grandmother to 7 energetic grandchildren. Sophia, Liam, Ethan, Oliver, Charlotte, Isabella, and Amelia became the lights of my life. I channeled my organizational skills into creating educational trust funds for each of them, carefully structured to both protect the assets and incentivize their academic achievements. Meanwhile, Blackwell Financial continued its impressive growth trajectory. By our 25th anniversary, we managed over $3 billion in assets through offices in 5 New England states. Gerald received the Financial Advisor of the Year award from the Northeast Planning Association. I attended the ceremony in a new dress, applauding supportively from Table 7 while he thanked his dedicated team, his visionary partners, and finally, my supportive wife, without whose patience this journey would have been impossible. Patience, as if that were my primary contribution. What no one in that ballroom knew, what even Gerald didn't know, was that throughout these years, I had maintained my own private financial activities. Using the knowledge I had gained tracking offshore movements in my early career, I established a network of small but growing accounts in the Cayman Islands, Singapore, and Liechtenstein. Nothing illegal. I paid all required taxes through carefully structured entities, but completely independent from our shared assets. I contributed to these accounts methodically. The consulting fee from advising my brother's manufacturing business, the proceeds from selling my mother's antiques after she moved to assisted living, the honorarium from the occasional university guest lecture I delivered. I invested these funds using the same strategies that had built Blackwell Financial, but with a focus on long-term growth rather than quarterly returns. After 25 years of disciplined contribution and compound growth, my personal offshore holdings had quietly grown to just over $18 million. It was my insurance policy. My grandmother's voice had never quite left my head. A woman must always have her own money that no one knows about. How prescient that advice would prove to be. The gradual unraveling of our marriage began on a mundane Tuesday in April. We were hosting the annual spring garden party for our top clients, an event I had orchestrated for 2 decades, when I first noticed the shift in Gerald's behavior. Was discussing estate planning strategies with Judge Harriman and his wife when I glanced across our meticulously landscaped backyard to see Gerald standing unusually close to his new executive assistant. Cassandra Bennett was laughing at something, he said, her hand resting briefly on his forearm in a gesture too intimate for a professional relationship. What struck me wasn't the gesture itself, but Gerald's response. His face softened in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. "Margaret, are you all right?" Mrs. Harriman asked, following my gaze. I composed myself quickly. "Just making sure?" "The caterers remembered the judge's preference for bourbon," I lied smoothly. Decades of social diplomacy serving me well. That night, after the last guest departed, I mentioned Cassandra's apparent familiarity casually. "Your new assistant seems quite comfortable with the clients already." Gerald loosened his tie, not meeting my eyes. "She's a natural. MBA from Wharton, you know. Sharp as they come." "And quite attractive," I observed neutrally. "I hadn't noticed," he said too quickly. "I don't hire for looks, Margaret." It was the first direct lie, the moment our marriage began its terminal decline. Over 30 years together, we had committed many marital sins, benign neglect during busy periods, occasional emotional distance, the mundane disappointments of long-term partnership, but never outright deception. In the weeks that followed, the evidence accumulated in small but unmistakable increments. Gerald's sudden attention to his appearance, new tailored shirts, expensive cologne, teeth-whitening treatments. His phone placed face down whenever I entered a room. Late night. Client emergencies that required his immediate attention. The shower he took immediately upon returning home, something he had never done before. I told myself these were the predictable symptoms of a man confronting mortality. At 71, perhaps he simply needed validation that he wasn't obsolete. I had read about this, the late-life crisis that strikes successful men when retirement looms and youth recedes. I convinced myself it would pass, that our shared history and accomplishments would prove stronger than whatever temporary madness had seized him. Then came the receipts. While searching for a missing tax document in Gerald's desk, I found a folder containing hotel invoices from the Four Seasons, just 3 blocks from our office. Dinner charges for 2 at restaurants I had never visited. A receipt for a platinum bracelet from Tiffany's dated 2 days before my birthday. A bracelet I had never received. Still, I said nothing. Something in me, pride perhaps or fear, couldn't bear to confront the obvious. Instead, I began my own investigation, drawing on analytical skills honed through decades of financial detective work. I noted the pattern of Gerald's absences. Tuesday, afternoons, Thursday evenings, occasional entire weekends allegedly spent at financial planning retreats. I tracked the unexplained charges on his credit card statements. I observed how often Cassandra's name appeared in his calendar, meetings that stretched longer than their agendas warranted. Then came Mother's Day, when Gerald was uncharacteristically attentive, bringing me breakfast in bed and an envelope containing tickets to the Boston Symphony Orchestra, a thoughtful gift that momentarily rekindled my hope that I had imagined the entire situation. "This is lovely, Gerald," I said, genuinely touched. "I thought you might have forgotten." He kissed my forehead. 30 years together, Margaret. Of course I wouldn't forget. That afternoon, while Gerald was allegedly meeting with an institutional client, I decided to organize his closet, a task he had always appreciated in the past. As I rearranged his suits by season, I felt something in the inner pocket of his summer blazer. A small velvet box contained diamond earrings with a gift note I wasn't meant to see. For my real celebration, can't wait for Paris. Love, C. The symphony ticket suddenly made sense. A guilt offering, a perfunctory acknowledgement before his planned romantic getaway with Cassandra. The realization hit me with physical force. I sat on the edge of our bed, the room spinning slightly as 3 decades of partnership collapsed into this single betrayal. When Gerald returned that evening, I said nothing about the earrings or the note. Some last vestige of dignity prevented me from becoming the accusations-hurling wife, the hysterical older woman confronting her husband's infidelity. Instead, I slipped the box back into his blazer and continued our macabre marital choreography. "How was the Carlton Foundation meeting?" I asked over dinner, knowing perfectly well there had been no such meeting. "Productive," Gerald replied, buttering his bread with steady hands. "They're considering increasing their portfolio with us." I nodded, studying the man across from me, this stranger wearing my husband's face. In that moment, I realized I was performing grief rather than experiencing it. The hollowness I felt wasn't heartbreak, but a peculiar sense of clarity. The man I had loved, the partnership I had valued, had perhaps never existed as I understood it. 2 days later, Gerald announced he would be attending a wealth management conference in Paris, a transparent cover for the trip promised in his note to Cassandra. I wished him a pleasant journey and began formulating a plan. While Gerald was in Paris, presumably with Cassandra exploring monuments and sharing intimate dinners, I conducted a thorough assessment of our actual financial position, not the polished version prepared for our tax returns, but the messy reality of our entangled assets. What I discovered shocked even me, despite my years of financial acumen. Gerald had begun systematically isolating certain assets, creating a complex structure of LLCs and holding companies that effectively placed millions beyond my potential. Reach in case of a divorce. Properties in Nantucket and Vermont that we had purchased together had been quietly transferred to corporate entities under his sole control. Investment accounts had been restructured with his siblings as contingent beneficiaries instead of me. Most disturbing was evidence that he had been artificially deflating the valuation of Blackwell Financial for at least 2 years, presumably, to minimize what I might claim as my share of the business. The company's actual performance suggested a valuation nearly double what appeared in our personal financial statements. The scope of this financial betrayal staggered me. While I had maintained my modest offshore accounts as a safety net, Gerald had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to completely disinherit me from the wealth we had built together. When Gerald returned from Paris, tanned and rejuvenated, I greeted him with practiced normalcy. Over dinner, I casually mentioned I had been thinking about our estate planning. "I worry about what would happen to me if something happened to you," I said, watching his expression carefully. "The company structure seems quite complex these days." Gerald's eyes flickered briefly before he arranged his features into a mask of reassurance. "Everything's well organized, Margaret. You'd be taken care of." "That's a relief," I said, sipping my wine. "I've always trusted you to handle the big financial picture." His slight smile confirmed what I already knew. He believed me completely ignorant of his machinations. The patronizing tenderness in his eyes as he reached for my hand nearly made me laugh aloud. How had I never before noticed the contempt beneath his affection? 2 weeks later, Gerald suggested we meet for lunch at La Saison, a quiet French restaurant where we had celebrated many anniversaries. I knew before he spoke what was coming. The setting was perfectly chosen for what he imagined would be a dignified, civilized dissolution. "Margaret," he began after our first course arrived, "we need to discuss the future." I set down my fork. "What about the future, Gerald?" He cleared his throat. "I think we both know things haven't been vibrant between us for some time." "Vibrant," I repeated, tasting the word's inadequacy. "I'll always care for you deeply," he continued, delivering what was clearly a rehearsed speech. "But at this stage of life, I need something different, a different kind of partnership." "With Cassandra," I said flatly. His surprise at my directness was almost comical. He recovered quickly. "Yes, with Cassandra. I didn't plan for this to happen." "Margaret, these things are complicated." "Not so complicated," I countered. "You're leaving your wife of 30 years for your 32-year-old secretary. It's rather a cliché, actually." Color rose in his face. "She's not just a secretary. She's a Harvard MBA with insights into modern portfolio theory That's enough, Gerald," I interrupted. "I don't need to hear about Cassandra's professional qualifications or what she does for you that I apparently don't. Just tell me what you're proposing." Relieved to move to the practical aspects, Gerald outlined his terms. He would keep the company and most of our liquid assets. I would receive the Westport house, a generous quarterly allowance, and a small portfolio of conservative investments. He emphasized repeatedly how fair this arrangement was, how it exceeded what most women my age received in divorce settlements. Listened silently, nodding occasionally as if considering his points. Inside, I was calculating exactly how much he was attempting to cheat me out of, approximately $42 million by my estimate. "I'll need time to think about this," I said finally. Gerald looked momentarily disconcerted. He had clearly expected either tearful acquiescence or emotional outburst, not this calm deliberation. "Of course," he said. "Take whatever time you need. My lawyer will draw up the preliminary papers." As we left the restaurant, he awkwardly attempted to hug me. I allowed it, like permitting a stranger to briefly enter my personal space. A minor discomfort soon to be over. "I hope we can handle this with dignity," he said, his hand lingering on my shoulder. "I intend to," I replied. That night, alone in our bedroom, I stood before the full-length mirror and truly looked at myself. I saw a 68-year-old woman with silver hair and laugh lines, a body that had borne 3 children and weathered the physical indignities of aging with as much grace as possible. But behind the softened jawline and creeped skin, I recognized something Gerald had evidently forgotten: the keen intelligence that had built a financial empire, the strategic mind that had navigated market collapse and recovery, the patient calculator who had quietly maintained her independent resources while appearing to surrender everything to the partnership. He has no idea who he's dealing with, I told my reflection. The next morning, I called my attorney friend Elaine Vashti and explained the situation in clinical detail. He wants to leave me with less than 20% of our actual net worth, I concluded. Unfortunately, common, Elaine sighed. But we have options. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state. Given the length of your marriage and your contributions to the business, we could likely secure 50% with a good judge. I don't want to rely on a sympathetic judge, I replied. I need something more definitive. There's one more thing you should know. I explained about my offshore accounts, the $18 million I had accumulated independently over decades. It's all legal, properly reported to tax authorities, but Gerald doesn't know about it. Elaine's eyes widened. That changes things considerably. You have your own financial cushion independent of whatever settlement we negotiate. Exactly, I said, which means I can afford to be patient and strategic. Over the next week, I methodically prepared for the confrontation I knew was coming. I gathered documentation of my early financial contributions to Blackwell Financial. I archived emails where Gerald had sought my input on investment strategies. I assembled a timeline of the company's growth that corresponded with innovations I had developed. Most importantly, I discreetly contacted Richard Drummond, whose wealth management firm Gerald planned to acquire through regulatory manipulation. Over lunch at a small cafe in Cambridge, far from financial district eyes, I showed him the document Gerald had accidentally sent me. Margaret, this is... Richard trailed off, shocked by what he was reading. Predatory, I finished for him, and entirely contrary to the values our firms supposedly share. Richard studied me carefully. Why are you showing me this? Gerald is your husband. For now, I replied. But this isn't about our marriage. It's about preventing an unethical business maneuver that would harm your family and tarnish whatever legacy Blackwell Financial might have. What I didn't mention was how perfectly this scenario served my longer-term strategy. Richard would now be prepared for Gerald's tactics, and the failed acquisition would damage Gerald's standing with the board just as our divorce proceedings were beginning. Timing in finance, as in revenge, is everything. The final element fell into place when my daughter Rebecca called, concerned about rumors she'd heard regarding her father and some young woman at the office. "Oh, darling," I said, allowing a slight tremor in my voice. "I was hoping to tell you in person." After explaining the situation as diplomatically as possible, I mentioned the upcoming divorce. "Your father believes I'll be well taken care of, with the house and a quarterly allowance." "That's insane," Rebecca said, outrage evident in her voice. "You built that company together. Everyone knows that." "Do they?" I asked softly. "I'm not sure your father remembers that anymore." By the time I received the formal summons to meet with Gerald and his attorney, I was fully prepared. As I sat across from them in that elegant office, watching Gerald slide the insulting settlement offer toward me, I allowed myself a moment of private satisfaction. He truly believed this was the end of our story, that I would meekly accept his terms and fade into a financially constrained retirement while he began a new life with Cassandra. What Gerald failed to understand was that this wasn't an ending at all. It was merely the opening move in a game I had been preparing to play for decades. The grandmother he had dismissed as irrelevant was about to teach him a crucial lesson about underestimating an opponent. As I left his attorney's office, that day, my perfectly reasonable counterproposal rejected as unrealistic, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The pretense was finally over. Now I could stop performing the role of supportive wife and reveal who I truly was. A financial strategist who had contingency plans Gerald couldn't begin to imagine. The grandmother was awake now, and she was coming for everything she had earned. Began my counteroffensive with precision, the same methodical approach that had guided my investment strategies for decades. First, I needed allies. People who understood both Gerald's true nature and the actual value of my contributions to Blackwell Financial. My first call was to Howard Sinclair, the firm's long-serving chief compliance officer. Howard had joined us 15 years ago, recruited from the SEC with promises of ethical leadership and work-life balance. What he found instead was Gerald's increasing willingness to skirt regulations while expecting Howard to provide legal cover. We met at a small cafe in Brookline, far from the financial district's watchful eyes. "I've been waiting for this conversation," Howard admitted, stirring his coffee nervously. At 59, with a receding hairline and perpetually worried expression, he looked older than his years. "Things have been concerning lately." "The Drummond acquisition," I said. He nodded grimly. "Among others, there's a pattern developing that makes me professionally uncomfortable." "Tell me about the others," I asked. For the next hour, Howard outlined a series of ethically questionable maneuvers Gerald had initiated over the past 2 years. Fee structures designed to obscure actual costs from clients, risk disclosures, buried in impenetrable language, internal performance metrics manipulated to enhance bonus calculations. "Why haven't you reported this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Howard sighed. "2 of my former colleagues tried whistleblowing at other firms. Both were blacklisted from the industry. I have twins starting college next year." He looked down at his hands. "But I can't sleep at night anymore." I reached across the table to touch his arm. "What if you had protection? Financial and legal?" His eyes met mine. "What are you suggesting, Margaret?" "Documentation," I replied. "Everything questionable you've observed, with dates, participants, and potential regulatory violations. In return, I guarantee your legal expenses covered and 2 years' salary if necessary." "Why would you do this?" "Because Gerald believes I'm a decorative accessory who planned charity functions," I said with a thin smile. "I'd like to correct that misapprehension." Howard agreed to compile the documentation, his relief at unburdening himself evident in the straightening of his shoulders as he left our meeting. My next alliance was more delicate. Patricia Harrington, the firm's director of client relations. Patricia had joined Blackwell 15 years ago and had directly experienced Gerald's habit of appropriating others' work. More importantly, she had managed our key client relationships during Gerald's frequent absences, preserving millions in assets that might otherwise have departed. We met under the pretense of discussing a charity event, a convincing cover given my historical role in such functions. Over tea in the Boston Public Garden, I broached the real purpose. "Patricia, how would you describe your contributions to Blackwell Financial?" I asked. She seemed startled by the directness of my question. "I'm just doing my job, Margaret." "No," I countered gently. "You've personally saved the Henderson and Talmadge accounts when Gerald was too distracted to notice their dissatisfaction. You redesigned our client communication system when the previous one failed during the 2018 volatility spike. You've been the actual relationship manager for our top 20 clients for at least 5 years. Her eyes widened. "You noticed all that?" "I notice everything," I replied, "including how Gerald has taken credit for your innovations while keeping your compensation significantly below industry standards for your responsibilities." Patricia was silent for a moment, absently watching a pair of swans glide across the pond. "Why are we really having this conversation, Margaret?" "Because changes are coming to Blackwell," I said. "And when they do, I want to ensure the right people are recognized and rewarded. By the time our tea concluded, Patricia had agreed to provide detailed records of client retention efforts and documentation of her unacknowledged contributions. More valuably, she offered insight into which board members might be receptive to concerns about Gerald's leadership. Lawrence Whitney has been uncomfortable with some recent decisions, she confided, and Sarah Chen has twice questioned the risk levels in our newer portfolios. My third alliance was both the most important and the most difficult, my son Daniel. As Blackwell's chief investment officer, Daniel stood to lose the most from any disruption. Gerald had been grooming him as his successor, a future increasingly in doubt if my plans proceeded. We met at his home in Cambridge while his wife took their children to soccer practice. "Mom, what's going on?" Daniel asked as soon as we were alone. Rebecca called me, but she was vague about details. I told him everything. The affair, the planned divorce, the systematic financial deception. His face darkened progressively as I spoke, his expression shifting from shock to anger. "That son of a bitch," he muttered when I finished. "How long have you known?" About the affair? Months? About the financial maneuvering? Weeks. Daniel paced the living room, running his hands through his hair, a gesture so like his father that it momentarily disoriented me. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to fight," I said simply. "But I need to know where you stand." Daniel stopped pacing and looked at me directly. At 42, he had Gerald's height and bearing but my analytical mind and ethical compass. "You're asking if I'll side with you against Dad." "I'm asking if you'll stand for what's right," I corrected. "Even if it complicates your professional future." He was quiet for a long moment. "Does this have to destroy the company? There are 300 employees who depend on Blackwell." "My goal isn't destruction," I assured him. "It's correction and justice. And if those goals conflict, then we'll find a third path," I promised. "But I won't be erased, Daniel. Not from the company I built, and not from my share of what we created together." Eventually, Daniel nodded. "I'll help, but I want to be involved in planning. No surprises that could damage the firm unnecessarily." With my initial allies secured, I turned to the evidence-gathering phase. My years tracking offshore financial movements proved invaluable, as I methodically documented Gerald's network of hidden assets and shell companies. I worked at night, using a secure laptop purchased for this purpose alone, tracing the labyrinthine pathways of our diverted marital assets. One particularly illuminating discovery came through an unexpected source: our family accountant, Joseph Perlman. Joseph had handled our personal taxes for 20 years, a quiet, meticulous man who had always treated me with professional respect, despite Gerald's tendency to direct all substantive financial discussions to himself. "I've been troubled by certain instructions I've received recently," Joseph confided when I invited him to discuss estate planning concerns. "Mr. Blackwell has requested several asset valuations that seem artificially conservative." "For tax purposes?" I asked innocently. Joseph hesitated. "The timing suggests other motivations. These requests began approximately 18 months ago, coinciding with his hiring of Cassandra Bennett," I finished for him. Joseph nodded uncomfortably. "I wouldn't presume to speculate about personal matters, but the correlation is difficult to ignore." By the end of our meeting, Joseph had provided copies of asset valuations showing dramatic discrepancies between actual worth and the figures Gerald had directed him to use in our personal financial statements, documents that would inevitably be referenced in divorce proceedings. Meanwhile, I quietly contacted specialists in asset protection and divorce law, carefully selecting advisors with no connection to Gerald's extensive professional network. A forensic accountant helped me trace the more sophisticated financial structures Gerald had created. A digital security expert ensured my communications remained private. A public relations consultant began developing a narrative strategy for what would likely become a high-profile divorce within Boston's financial community. Throughout this process, I maintained a facade of ignorant compliance. I attended the necessary social functions, managed the Westport house as always, and responded to Gerald's increasingly perfunctory communications with practiced pleasantness. When he called to say he'd be working late or had client meetings out of town, I expressed no suspicion or resentment. This performance served two purposes. It kept Gerald complacent, convinced I would accept whatever settlement he offered, and it gave me the time needed to complete my preparations. The most delicate aspect of my strategy involved Blackwell Financial's board of directors. While Gerald was the public face and CEO, major decisions required board approval. Through Patricia Harrington's insights and my own long-standing social connections, I identified 3 board members potentially receptive to concerns about Gerald's leadership. Lawrence Whitney had been with us since the beginning, an early investor who had supported our initial expansion. Now in his 70s, Lawrence remained a voice of conservative fiscal management on the board. I invited him and his wife Helen to dinner at our club, ostensibly to discuss a scholarship program for underprivileged students, a cause Helen championed. After appropriate social pleasantries and genuine discussion of the scholarship, I guided the conversation toward Blackwell Financial's direction. "Lawrence, I've noticed a shift in our company's approach to certain regulatory considerations," I said carefully. "It reminds me of patterns before the 2008 crisis." Lawrence's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's an interesting observation, Margaret. Most people see you primarily as Gerald's wife," I finished with a measured smile. "But I've always been more than that, though it suited everyone to pretend otherwise." "Not everyone," Lawrence corrected. "Some of us remember your analytical work during the early years. Your risk assessment framework saved countless clients during the downturn." "A framework that's being systematically dismantled," I noted, "along with other safeguards." By the time dessert arrived, Lawrence was asking pointed questions about specific decisions that had troubled him. I provided just enough information to fuel his concerns without revealing my larger strategy. As we parted, he squeezed my hand significantly. "I've always thought Gerald underestimated you, Margaret. Perhaps I did too." Similar conversations with board members Sarah Chen and Robert Jacobson yielded additional allies, though each required a different approach. Sarah, the youngest board member and the only woman besides myself with significant financial expertise, responded to direct discussion of the mounting risk exposure in our newer investment vehicles. Robert, whose family had been clients since our first year, was more moved by concerns about Gerald's deteriorating client attentiveness. While building these external alliances, I also focused on securing my personal position. I transferred selected assets to irrevocable trusts for my grandchildren, placing them beyond Gerald's reach while ensuring my family's future security. I documented every instance of Gerald using company resources to facilitate his relationship with Cassandra: the corporate jet trips, the client development expenses at luxury hotels, the consulting fees paid to shell companies that ultimately benefited her. Most importantly, I established irrefutable proof of my contributions to Blackwell Financial from its inception. Through archived documents, former employee testimonials, and recovered electronic records, I created a comprehensive timeline demonstrating my integral role in every major success the company had achieved. The decisive evidence came from an unexpected source: Gerald's former executive assistant, Miranda Sullivan. Now retired and living in Vermont, Miranda had maintained her own detailed records during her 15 years with the company. Her documentation included countless instances where my analyses and strategies had been presented as Gerald's work, often with his explicit instructions to remove my name from reports and presentations. "He always said it was for brand consistency," Miranda explained during our discreet meeting at her lakeside home. "But even then, it seemed wrong to erase your contributions so completely." The final element of my preparation involved my offshore accounts. While perfectly legal, I had always properly reported them on tax filings. Their existence would come as a complete surprise to Gerald, who had assumed complete control of our finances decades ago. Working with specialist attorneys, I strategically repositioned these assets to maximize their impact when eventually revealed. By the time Gerald's attorney formally presented the divorce terms at that fateful meeting, I had assembled a comprehensive counteroffensive. My resource network included legal experts, financial investigators, sympathetic board members, current and former employees willing to testify to my contributions, and documented evidence of both personal and professional misconduct as I left. The attorney's office that day, rejecting their insulting offer with calm dignity, Gerald believed he was watching the defeated retreat of a discarded wife. What he actually witnessed was a strategic withdrawal before the main assault. That evening, alone in the Westport house Gerald expected me to soon vacate, I reviewed my preparations one final time. Every contingency had been anticipated, every vulnerability addressed, every alliance secured. After decades of working in Gerald's shadow, I would finally step into the light, not as the supportive wife, but as the financial strategist I had always been. I thought about my grandchildren, especially little Charlotte, who at 8 already showed signs of the analytical mind that had served me so well. I wanted her to witness a grandmother who refused to be diminished, who fought for recognition and justice. What lesson would my acquiescence teach her about a woman's value? The next morning, I called Elaine Vashti. "I'm ready," I said simply. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Once we begin, there's no turning back." I thought of Gerald and Cassandra planning their new life with my money in a company I had helped build, while dismissing me with a patronizing allowance. I thought of 30 years of unacknowledged work, of credit stolen and contributions erased. "I've never been more certain of anything," I replied. It's time Gerald learned who he's really been married to all these years. Within 24 hours, the carefully constructed facade of Gerald's life would begin to crumble. The grandmother he had underestimated was about to demonstrate the full extent of her capabilities, and the cost of his betrayal would far exceed anything he had anticipated. The resistance wasn't just beginning, it was about to become a reckoning. The Boston financial district hummed with its usual Monday morning energy as I entered the gleaming Blackwell Financial headquarters on State Street. The security guard, accustomed to seeing me only at company, social functions, looked momentarily confused. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said, recovering quickly. "I don't believe you're on today's visitor list." "I won't be needing a visitor pass, Thomas," I replied pleasantly. "I'm here for the emergency board meeting." His confusion deepened. "Ma'am, I don't have any board meeting on the schedule." "You will shortly," I assured him, just as my son Daniel stepped off the elevator. "It's fine, Thomas," Daniel said, his expression carefully neutral. "My mother will be accompanying me to the executive floor." As we ascended in the private elevator, Daniel kept his voice low. "Dad arrived an hour ago. He's in a strategy session with the acquisition team." "Perfect timing," I noted, straightening. My tailored navy suit, a power color deliberately chosen for this day. The executive floor buzzed with subdued tension. Word had spread quickly after board members received the early morning email calling for an emergency session. The official reason, urgent governance matters requiring immediate attention, had triggered speculation throughout the firm. Patricia Harrington intercepted us in the corridor, her normally composed features tight with anxiety. "They're all here," she murmured, "including those calling in remotely." "And Gerald?" I asked. "Still unaware," she confirmed. "His assistant is under instructions to interrupt his meeting in 10 minutes. I nodded, feeling a curious sense of calm. After months of preparation, years of diminishment, and decades of unacknowledged contribution, the moment of reckoning had arrived. The Blackwell Financial boardroom embodied the tasteful opulence Gerald favored: hand-carved mahogany table, subtly patterned silk wall covering, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. I had selected most of these elements during the office renovation 5 years earlier, though Gerald had presented the design concepts as his own vision. I entered, conversation ceased abruptly. 11 board members, some present physically, others on video screens, regarded me with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern to barely concealed anticipation. Margaret. Lawrence Whitney rose from his seat, courteous as always. I believe I speak for everyone when I say we're somewhat confused about the purpose of this meeting. All will be clear shortly, I assured him, taking a seat not at the periphery where wives were typically relegated during social events, but directly at the head of the table, Gerald's customary position. The deliberate symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Several board members exchanged glances, while Robert Jacobson cleared his throat uncomfortably. Howard Sinclair entered quietly, carrying a leather portfolio, and took a seat near the door. Moments later, Elaine Vashti arrived with 2 colleagues, their formal attire and document cases marking them unmistakably as legal representatives. At precisely 9:30, the boardroom door opened again, and Gerald appeared, his expression transitioning from annoyance to astonishment as he registered my presence in his chair. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, gaze sweeping the room before settling on me. "Margaret, this is completely inappropriate. Whatever domestic issues we're addressing have no place in a board meeting." "I disagree," I replied evenly. "When domestic issues intersect with corporate governance, fiduciary responsibility, and potential regulatory violations, this is precisely where they belong." Gerald's face flushed. "I don't know what game you're playing, but this isn't a game," I interrupted, my voice steady. "Please take a seat, Gerald. You'll want to be sitting for what comes next." Lawrence Whitney cleared his throat. "Given the unusual circumstances, I move that we allow Mrs. Blackwell to address the board before proceeding further." Sarah Chen seconded immediately. When no objections came, even from Gerald's typically reliable allies, I knew the preliminary conversations with board members had served their purpose. "Thank you," I began, opening the presentation folder before me. "I'll be direct. For 30 years, I have been an unacknowledged partner in building Blackwell Financial from a 2-person advisory service to the institution it is today. My financial contributions, strategic innovations, and client relationship management have been systematically obscured while Gerald presented my work as his own. I distributed documents showing my initial capital contribution, larger than Gerald's, and early client presentations bearing my handwriting and analysis approach. More recently, I continued, I have discovered disturbing patterns of corporate governance failures, ethical breaches, and potential regulatory violations that put this institution and its clients at significant risk. Howard Sinclair rose at my nod, distributing his own meticulously prepared documentation. "As Chief Compliance Officer, I am obligated to bring these matters to the board's attention," he stated formally, avoiding Gerald's incredulous stare. For the next 20 minutes, I methodically outlined Gerald's financial manipulations, his exploitation of client relationships, and most damningly, his use of company resources to fund his relationship with Cassandra Bennett. Flight logs showing Ms. Bennett accompanying Mr. Blackwell to client meetings that never occurred, I noted, displaying the relevant documents on the boardroom screen. Hotel reservations in Paris, Rome, and St. Bart's charged to corporate accounts, but serving no legitimate business purpose. Consulting fees paid to shell companies that ultimately benefited Ms. Bennett personally. Gerald's face had progressed from angry red to ashen. "This is a vindictive distortion by a bitter woman," he sputtered. "Margaret is upset about our impending divorce and retaliating with baseless accusations." "Not baseless," countered Howard, highlighting specific transactions. "Each allegation is supported by documentation, including Mr. Blackwell's written directives to categorize personal expenses as business expenditures. A clear violation of both company policy and tax regulations." Sarah Chen leaned forward. "These are serious allegations, Gerald. If even half are accurate, we have significant exposure." More concerning, added Lawrence Whitney, studying the financial records, is this pattern of asset manipulation. These valuations are deliberately misleading. Gerald's desperation became palpable. He turned to Daniel, clearly expecting filial support. You can't possibly condone this ambush. She's your mother, but I'm your father and your professional mentor. Daniel met his father's gaze steadily. I'm the Chief Investment Officer of Blackwell Financial. My duty is to the company and its clients, not to either of my parents personally. These documents reveal practices I cannot defend, regardless of who initiated them. I continued my presentation, revealing Gerald's planned predatory acquisition of Drummond Wealth Management and his systematic efforts to hide marital assets in anticipation of our divorce. In summary, I concluded, Gerald has breached his fiduciary duty to this company, violated regulatory standards, misappropriated corporate resources, and created significant legal exposure for Blackwell Financial. As responsible board members, you face a clear choice regarding appropriate governance action. The silence that followed felt weightless, a moment suspended between the past and whatever would come next. Robert Jacobson broke it first. Margaret, while these allegations are deeply troubling, what specifically are you seeking from the board today? 3 actions, I replied promptly. First, an independent investigation into all financial and regulatory matters I've identified. Second, immediate suspension of Gerald from management responsibilities pending investigation results. Third, recognition of my historical role through appropriate equity compensation and board representation. Gerald found his voice again, desperate now. This is extortion. She's using corporate governance to gain leverage in our divorce proceedings. Actually, interjected Elaine Vashti, speaking for the first time, Mrs. Blackwell has filed separate civil actions regarding the marital asset concealment. Today's matters concern corporate governance only. The board entered executive session, asking Gerald and me to step out while they deliberated. In the anteroom, we sat on opposite sides, the marble table between us like a demilitarized zone. You won't win this, Gerald said quietly, his voice lacking its usual confidence. I built this company. We built this company, I corrected him. Your mistake was forgetting that. They'll never take your side, he insisted. You're just my wife. I studied him with something approaching pity. That's exactly the mindset that brought us here, Gerald. You never saw me as your equal partner, even when the evidence was right in front of you. When we were summoned back, the board's decision was decisive. Gerald would be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. A special committee would review my equity claim based on historical contribution evidence. And most devastating to Gerald, Daniel would serve as interim CEO. As the implications sank in, Gerald's composure finally shattered. This is insanity, he hissed. You can't let a vindictive ex-wife destroy everything I've built. The only person who has jeopardized Blackwell Financial is you, Lawrence Whitney replied firmly. Your personal conduct and professional decisions have created this situation, not Margaret. As the meeting concluded, Gerald stormed out, nearly colliding with a young woman entering with a stack of documents, Cassandra Bennett, looking confused and increasingly alarmed as she registered the boardroom scene. Our eyes met briefly. In hers, I saw dawning comprehension and, perhaps, a glimpse of her own future. The inevitable moment when she too would be discarded for a newer model once her youth faded. The weeks that followed brought systematic unraveling of Gerald's carefully constructed facade. The independent investigation confirmed every allegation and uncovered additional improprieties. Regulatory authorities became involved, focused particularly on misleading client disclosures and expense mischaracterizations. The divorce proceedings, running parallel to the corporate investigation, revealed the full extent of Gerald's financial deception. His hidden assets were systematically exposed, each discovery strengthening my negotiating position. Then came the moment Gerald had never anticipated. the revelation of my offshore accounts. We sat in my attorney's conference room, Gerald flanked by his increasingly uncomfortable legal team. The preliminary asset division discussion had stalled over his continued insistence that certain holdings were premarital or independently developed and therefore exempt from division. Before we proceed further, Elaine said smoothly, we should ensure complete financial transparency from both parties. She slid a document across the table detailing my Cayman Islands, Singapore, and Liechtenstein accounts, a total of $18.7 million that had never appeared in our marital financial statements. Gerald stared at the figures in disbelief. This is impossible, he sputtered. Where would she get this kind of money? Mrs. Blackwell was a financial analyst specializing in offshore transactions before your marriage, Elaine reminded him. She maintained modest independent investments throughout your relationship, properly reported on tax filings you apparently never reviewed. The blood drained from Gerald's face as he realized the implications. His leverage, my presumed financial dependence, had just evaporated completely. You've been playing me, he said quietly, looking at me with new eyes. All these years. No, I corrected him. I've been protecting myself as my grandmother taught me. The difference is significant. His attorney leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear. Gerald's shoulders slumped slightly as he received what was clearly unwelcome advice. By day's end, we had a settlement framework that awarded me 52% of our marital assets, full ownership of the Westport house, and appropriate compensation for my unacknowledged contributions to Blackwell Financial. More satisfying than the financial terms was Gerald's visible recognition, at last, of who I truly was. Not just his wife, but a financial strategist who had quietly outmaneuvered him at his own game. 6 months later, the corporate investigation concluded with sweeping recommendations for governance reform at Blackwell Financial. Gerald negotiated a retirement package significantly smaller than he had once anticipated, contingent on his cooperation with ongoing regulatory inquiries. Cassandra Bennett departed for a position at a smaller firm, her meteoric rise abruptly stalled by her association with Gerald's misconduct. The board formally recognized my historical contributions, granting me appropriate equity compensation and a non-executive director position, focusing on client relationship management and ethics oversight. Daniel's interim leadership proved so effective that the interim was eventually removed from his title, making him the youngest CEO in the firm's history. On a crisp autumn afternoon, I hosted a small gathering at the Westport house, my house now, legally and psychologically. My 3 children and their spouses attended, along with all 7 grandchildren racing across the lawn in a chaotic game of their own invention. Rebecca joined me on the terrace, watching her daughters Charlotte and Isabella attempting to teach 3-year-old Amelia how to cartwheel. I'm still processing everything that happened, she admitted, sipping her wine. Dad seems so diminished now. Your father diminished himself, I replied gently. He forgot that partnerships, in marriage or business, require mutual respect, but you knew, didn't you? Rebecca asked. All those years, you knew what you were capable of. I considered this. I always knew my own value. I just allowed others to underestimate it for too long. Why? She pressed. You could have demanded recognition decades ago. Different generations, different battles, I explained. In my time, women fought for inclusion first, recognition second. The world you and my granddaughters inhabit allows for both simultaneously. We watched as Charlotte successfully taught Amelia a wobbly version of a cartwheel, both girls dissolving into giggles on the grass. What will you do now? Rebecca asked. You're 68 with financial independence, professional recognition, and no husband dictating your schedule for the first time in 30 years. I smiled. Everything I want. The following week brought an unexpected encounter. I was leaving a lunch meeting with Blackwell's newly established ethics committee when I spotted Gerald at a corner table in the same restaurant. He was alone, the empty chair across from him suggesting a companion who had either not arrived or recently departed. Our eyes met across the crowded space. After a moment's hesitation, I approached his table. "Gerald," I said simply. He gestured to the empty chair. "Margaret, you're looking well." I sat briefly, noting the changes in his appearance. His expensive suit hung slightly loose, his face more lined than I remembered. "How are you adjusting?" "To professional disgrace and personal failure?" he asked, with unexpected candor. "Not particularly well." "That wasn't my intention," I said truthfully. "Justice was my goal, not your destruction. A distinction that matters little from my perspective." He studied me with genuine curiosity. "How did I not see it? All those years?" "You saw what you expected to see," I replied. "A supporting character in your story, not the co-author of our shared one." He nodded slowly. "The offshore accounts? When did that begin?" "Before I met you," I said. "My grandmother lived through the Depression and her husband's abandonment. She taught me never to be financially dependent on anyone." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Smart woman." "She was," I agreed, rising to leave. "As it turns out, so am I." As I walked away, I felt no triumph, no vindictive satisfaction, only the quiet peace of finally being seen for who I truly was. In the year that followed, I divided my time between board responsibilities, mentoring programs for women in finance, and actually enjoying my grandchildren without the constant background hum of unacknowledged resentment. I established a foundation supporting financial literacy for women of all ages, using my newfound public platform to advocate for recognition of women's often invisible contributions to family businesses. Gerald relocated to Arizona, ostensibly for the climate, but more likely to escape the whispers that followed him in Boston financial circles. Our paths crossed occasionally at family events, graduations, weddings, holiday gatherings where civilized interaction was necessary. We developed a cordial if distant coexistence, bound together by our children and grandchildren if nothing else. During one such occasion, our granddaughter Charlotte's middle school graduation, Gerald approached me while I was alone, admiring the school's flower gardens. "I've been reflecting on what happened," he said without preamble. "Not just the divorce or the company investigation, but all of it. 30 years together." "And?" I prompted when he fell silent. "I never really knew you," he said simply. "I lived with you for 3 decades, but I never truly saw beyond what I wanted you to be." "That's remarkably insightful," I observed, genuinely surprised by his self-awareness. He shrugged slightly. "Disgrace provides ample time for reflection." "For what?" "It's worth, I'm sorry, not just for Cassandra or the divorce, but for never acknowledging your true value." I studied the man I had once loved, now transformed by consequences into someone capable of genuine introspection. "Thank you for that," I said quietly. "It matters, even now." As we rejoined the family celebration, watching Charlotte accept her Academic Achievement Award, I felt a complex emotion that wasn't quite forgiveness but approached understanding. Gerald and I had both been products of our generation. He programmed to expect a supporting wife. I conditioned to provide that support even at the cost of my own recognition. The difference was that I had eventually broken free of those expectations, reclaiming my narrative and my worth. The grandmother who had seemed invisible, useful primarily for holiday hosting and babysitting, had revealed herself as a financial strategist, a corporate whistleblower, and ultimately the architect of her own liberation. That evening, as I sat in my garden watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, I thought about the journey from betrayal to reclamation. Gerald's abandonment, painful as it was, had ultimately freed me to become fully myself, to step out of the supporting role I had accepted for too long. My offshore accounts, begun as a safety net, had become a symbol of something more profound, my refusal to be completely subsumed, my quiet insistence on maintaining some separate identity, even while playing the role expected of me. I opened my laptop to find an email from a young woman I'd been mentoring at Blackwell Financial. She had just received her first promotion and wanted to share the news. "I keep thinking about what you told me," she wrote, "that our contributions don't need external validation to have value, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't insist they be recognized." I smiled, thinking of my granddaughters growing up in a world where women's contributions, financial, intellectual, creative, would hopefully be acknowledged as matter-of-factly as men's had always been. Where a woman's worth wouldn't be diminished by marriage or motherhood or age. The French doors opened behind me, and Daniel appeared with a stack of board documents for the next day's meeting. "Still working?" he asked, setting them beside me. "You're supposed to be enjoying semi-retirement." "I am," I assured him. "This is what enjoyment looks like for me." After he left, I returned to watching the sunset, content in the knowledge that while Gerald had intended my story to end with dismissal and diminishment, I had instead written a new chapter, one where the overlooked grandmother proved to be the most strategic player of all. My offshore accounts hadn't just secured my financial future. They had symbolized a deeper truth I had always known but finally demonstrated to the world. That a woman's value doesn't diminish with age or depend on male recognition. It exists independently, a quiet power waiting to be claimed. And in the end, that reclamation, not the money, not the professional acknowledgement, not even the vindication, was my true victory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.